Greetings, members of the Brotherhood and Regenerated family. I'm going to be walking you through our first long form narrative book that we're going to be reading in the Regenerated Brotherhood. We will also be posting breakdowns of each chapter on our Substack, so you can be sure to follow there for more. And we'll probably touch on some of this in our podcast. But without further ado, let me dive into one of my favorite books of all time, certainly one of my top 3 favorite books. It's up there with books like The Silmarillion. And in particular, why I love this book is because it's a story of our heritage as Americans. In particular, I have family that hails from the region of Kentucky, and we have a lot of guys in our brotherhood who are from this region. We want to be proud of our heritage, and we also want to know the true and the full history of the United States. And this is a lesser known account of the westward expansion of America in its infancy. Ultimately, as the picture describes here, it's an epic account of the brutality and the bravery in the forging of America. This book truly is about the forging of our nation. And it's the part of our nation that was developing at the same time as the war for independence, commonly referred to as the Revolutionary War, was happening. And what we're going to be doing following this book is to go through the historiographical and thematic breakdown from a Christian lens, this epic narrative written by Allan Eckert. So I want to share a little bit about the history of the book. First of all, this book was written in 1967, but Allan put over 7 years of research into the book. So if you consider the 7 years of investigation and research that he did, which was very impressive for the time, remember this is before the internet and before all of the different types of evidence and things that we have now, he goes to the firsthand accounts. And that's no easy task when he's going 200 years into the past to look into what evidence there is. And thankfully, there are a lot of journal entries, and American history is very well recorded, particularly compared to a lot of other cultures. And so we're grateful for that. Also being a nation that was founded later on in human history, or closer to where we are now. So it's initially published as a hardcover, and I actually have one of those original hardcover publishings right here. Beautiful book. Highly recommend you get your hands on it. I'll post some more pictures of it, but this is what it looks like. And they're pretty difficult to get, and they're expensive, but it's worth having a copy. In fact, the Frontiersmen is one of what became a trilogy of novels. On the winning of America is what he called his first trilogy. And then, so this is the third book in the trilogy, The Conquerors. I'm still trying to get my hand on the middle book in this same beautiful hardcover. But you can actually get a paperback like you see on the screen here. And I highly recommend getting one of those. Just getting an older book and a hands-on book is something that you can give to your kids. And it's a part of history in the writing in this book, because in the 70s, this book really explodes in popularity. And this was during the bicentennial, the 200th anniversary of America. And there was a massive run of this. Now, what I would like to see, there is a current iteration in a paperback form that you can find on Amazon for about $35. It's a solid book. And I would love to see that sell out, because we are now at the 250th anniversary of the founding of America. So about 50 years later, we really want to reawaken a love for this book. This book was pivotal for me when I read it in high school. Early on, actually, no, this was in middle school that I first read it. And then revisiting it now has just given me all the more excitement about our nation. Now, the transformational mind shift that generations had after reading this series of The Winning of America basically took the focus from being so centered on the East Coast and the politics of the country of that side, and looked at the overall scope of America as one nation, which is very there's a lot of diversity, considering America was slowly settled over time. And I would say the arching theme of this book is that America was conquered and not settled. And that is a very important difference, which we'll break down later on. Now, a little bit about the book. There's some pushback against it by modern historians, as there is basically with any older book or any type of based history. But this truly is a historical book. And in the very beginning, his first line is that this book is fact, not fiction. However, he's very careful to say what he has had to fill in. For instance, he takes the journal entries that he finds, and he'll often put that as dialogue, as a note of the character. And the book is written in linear fashion with dates that are meticulously recorded, and it goes from battle to battle. So all of the major events of this book and the characters are real people, which is awesome. And the book is so much more compelling this way, because it's not written as an academic biography like most books that we're reading now at the time period, but it's written as an epic narrative. It's written as a story. And that takes a lot of skill to take historical evidence and write it into the story. And we shouldn't balk at this means of writing, because this is even something that biblical authors employ. You often have people who are writing about events that took place before them in scripture, and they're filling in notes and even telling you what the intent of the speaker that they're talking about or the intent of the character is. For example, in the Gospel of John, you have John mention that Jesus knew what was in the hearts of men. So he's adding his interpretation. And of course, with scripture, it's a correct interpretation. So that's really where we're trying to get at, is that this is historical. It's not really historical fiction per se. It is myth, and it's got novelistic flair. So it's historical fact that has been novelized and been turned into a narrative. And we have to also remember that this is the way that most cultures in history pass down their traditions, and their history was orally and not only written. And an oral history is going to entail story and mythos, because that is the way that humans remember and are compelled to act upon the history that they've been given. And so that's what this book does masterfully, and we really love that style. So he uses extreme novelistic flair. It's extreme in the sense that it's not academic, and that's what we're used to in a postmodern society, even though we've now abandoned fact and truth in favor of feeling in our modern time. And that's something that this book does. It evokes a sense of pride and of gut wrenching as you read the book, and any good story is going to do that. So we really like the biblical way that this story is written. Now, the premise and the backdrop is really important. This frontier that we're going to be focusing on in the book, The Frontiersmen, is about this transformative region of the country that people had assumptions about, but when they entered the land, it not only transformed them, but it shaped our nation, and it shaped the men who entered it. So that's the primary component of this book. And the time frame that it's written in is the 1755. That's the birth of the main character of the book, who is the frontiersman premier. And he's one of many frontiersmen. There's other characters in this book that you'll recognize, which I'll mention. And it goes into about the first third of the 19th century, 1836. So this is really the winning of America, in the sense that it precedes and is happening at the same time as the War for Independence, or the Revolutionary War, as many often call it, right on the tail of the French and Indian War. And then it goes into the War for 1812, which is a war that we very nearly lost. And without the frontiersmen, we certainly would have. That's something that most people don't know. They don't realize how different that war was and how close we came to losing our nation in its infancy. Now, the 80-year history about this book expands the agrarian republic, which is important because as men moved and settled west, the land was untamed, as we'll see. And they also collide with the indigenous confederacy, which is an important note of this book. We often have misnomers either of the Indians as noble savages and peaceful and in harmony with the land and each other, which is definitely a myth. And certainly there were some exceptions to that, but by and large, the Indians were not united, and they fought each other, which is why they were subject to being conquered. But the amazing thing about this book is that it's about the Americans who at the same time were learning to become united as a tribe, because we have to remember that America was settled, and the Europeans that came here oftentimes came from persecution, particularly the Puritans, who had been in the country and established their presence for about 100 years before this book. So we have a really solid American culture before even the founding of America. If we look at the mid 17th century, the 1640s, all the way into the War for Independence, when the Declaration of America is written and America becomes an official nation. All during that time, the colonials, and before them, the Puritan settlers, they had to work with the natives, and they had to trade, and they had to bring the Christian worldview into what was also a hostile land, but not to the degree that they're going to experience when they push west at this time. So the frontiersman really takes the warfare of America to the next level, when the Indians realize that unless they start to come together, and not all of them realize this, really only a few key figures, when they realize that there's no way for them to stem the tide of all of the refugees and settlers, because again, a lot of the early American settlers were refugees, political and religious refugees coming from Europe, but they brought a lot of technology, they brought civilization, they brought Christianity, which was a dominant worldview, and they also brought common law, which is going to collide with the pagan and also the different way of living of the indigenous peoples here. Now, the pool of the frontier was this place called the Kentucky. Of course, we have the state known as Kentucky, but this is a mythic place that was basically considered a new Eden. And of course, the original settlers that came to the New World, America, they very much thought the same and experienced the same in different places where they landed. That's not to say they had it easy. Many people died. The majority of the first pilgrims that came here died. But they find that this is a land that it has untapped potential by and large. And the people living there they had good skills and they knew how to survive off the land. But because they weren't large in number, the Indians, and also because they weren't united and they were very tribalistic, the whites who settled in America formed their own colonies and tribes all over, because this is a massive continent, it's a massive country. And as they're pushing west, they hear about these mythic cane lands that seem to them to be a very fertile and easy to tame place, or at least a place where they can have a new start. And that becomes quickly apparent that even though there's a lot of potential of this land, the land needs to be dominated. And the people who are currently inhabiting the land and are interspersed throughout the land are also going to be very hostile. And that's particularly the Shawnee tribe and all of the other Indians as well. And so they're encountering more hostility the further west that they go into the wild land, which they think at the beginning is kind of an Eden. And this is important because in the biblical picture, we have very much the same in the Garden of Eden. God creates the world. He puts Adam in the garden, and he gives Adam dominion, but he tells him he needs to go take dominion of the rest of the world, including the sky and the sea, where those creatures are. And that should tell us something about the martial virtue and the nature of man, which is to face hostility, because in that word, take dominion, to subdue is the better word. When God tells Adam to subdue, it entails this necessary resistance and force that he's going to have to use. And of course, now we're dealing with a fallen and violent world in this part of our history. So the reality is that this was basically a very deadly middle ground. Before they could get to the plains and other places, they had to go through a very untamed territory. And this territory is so different now than what it was back then. When my grandfather grew up in the 20th century in Kentucky, it really wasn't Eden because it had been tamed. There were no more dangerous wildlife. The land had been largely terraformed, a lot less forest and giant old growth forest, and it has now it became some of the most fertile land in the world. And unfortunately, we've really destroyed it with conventional agriculture. But where we had good soil and where we have a lot of ranching and everything now, and a lot of growth, that had to be hacked out of the wilderness. And so the scale is unimaginably vast. And we have all kinds of journals and firsthand accounts. And in this book, it really describes it. Basically, they can't get anywhere west and they can't navigate it all without using the rivers. And America has the most navigable rivers in the world, I think more than every other continent combined by a couple times at least. And so that really enabled people to move into the interior, which was very dense and otherwise would have been extremely difficult. So the rivers play a very important role in the forming and the forging of America. Now, another component of this book is military evolution, because we have to go from becoming a colonial military power that fights off, to our credit, the greatest empire in world history. And men have still learned to bring on some tactics from the French and Indian War. But at the same time, fighting the British, who come from the same continent that we originally did, is very different from fighting the natives. And in fact, later on in the War of 1812s, the British apparently learned their lesson, and they use the Indians as their cannon fodder, as the front line, and they rely on them and they equip them to try to take back America. And they do this from their masthead in Detroit. And of course, we know that the British still controlled Canada, and that's part of their empire still to this day. So because of that, the war basically isn't finished after the War for Independence. And then there's immediately another war that we almost lose because the American military forgets. They assume that they can use the same tactics and the same generals and the same leaders who have become aged and really was a hard-won war of the War for Independence, and they send those guys to the frontier, which is a totally different environment and a different enemy, and we very nearly lose. In fact, a lot of battles and a lot of men are lost, and it's a hard-won lesson to put the right guys in charge. So this is a book about leadership, and it's a book about men who are competent and who are good leaders, and bad leadership leads to death and chaos, and good leadership leads to the success of the nation. And that's one of the greatest lessons in this book. Also, fraternity and guys banding together, because lone rangers, we find in the book, quickly are targets and they die. So the struggle of the main character is going to be not only to band with other men, but to protect and provide for people as they settle, because without working together, Americans would quickly perish, and did quickly perish when they entered the frontier. So with the military evolution of the characters in the book, they have to go from being individuals to working in tribal coalitions. So we can look at different bands of hunters and frontiersmen and scouts. And then eventually they become an institutional force that the United States government realizes they must rely on. Otherwise, their armies are going to be defeated because they don't know how to fight this type of war. So there's some really incredible characters in this book. Some side characters I mentioned earlier, I was going to say, are Daniel Boone. We have George Rogers Clark, who's one of my favorite characters in the book. And then we have other guys like Anthony Wayne. And in order to not only beat the British back because they've circumvented the East Coast now and are established in Detroit and the Great Lakes, which are like oceans to these guys. They and then to fight the Indians as well, the Americans have to learn to use the skills of the frontiersmen who have taken the best tactics of the Indians and combine them, just like the Indians take the firearms from the whites, which are going to be rifles. And so it very much becomes an even match because you have the whites who have adopted the weapon of the tomahawk, and you have the Indians who have adopted the rifle. And so the playing field is essentially leveled, and you have to rely on the guys who know the environment in order to win. So the whole challenge of the book is who's going to rely on good leaders and who's going to follow the right leadership. And that's a challenge for both the whites and the Indians. Are they going to band together, and are they going to trust the guys who know what they're doing, or are they going to be prideful and deceitful and break their covenants? Because covenant is another huge aspect of this book. So ultimately, frontier warfare is very brutal. It's some of the most brutal warfare that you'll read about. And it's intertwined with also this code of honor. So you have the horror of war and the honor of war. And of course, this is something you find when you study warfare, everything from the Roman wars and the Greek wars, all the way to the Crusades and the wars in Europe. And we find, particularly at this evolution in the stage of warfare in human history, there's this respect that goes both ways. And covenants. This is a really important part of the warfare. The creating of treaties and the creating of alliances and the breaking of those is going to make or break the side that wins this war. So the horror was this really difficult section of the book and of American history that when you read it, you find yourself really tied in knots multiple times. This is a very brutal book, and it's not gratuitous by any means, but it's going to tell you how guys are killed, they're scalped, what types of torture they go through, because that was all part of particularly the Indian culture. And as the frontiersmen encounter these violent, brutal natives, some of them adopt those same characteristics. And so what we see here is that there's nuance within the two tribes, the whites and the Indians, and there are bad characters on both sides. And there's essentially depraved men on both sides. And what is going to win out is the culture that ultimately has a greater morality and has cast off depravity. And again, also the breaking and the making of covenants is another important component. And then ultimately, who just has the superior people and who has a superior fighting force and who's able to unite is going to win. So that's two components of this book that are really, really important. The clash of cultures in this book is also something that is essentially the backdrop the entire time. You have the American ideology, which is viewing land as a deeded resource that could be claimed, and then people would take up permanent residence in a land. That was the goal of the settlers. They're going to settle and they're going to make a productive slice of Eden. Whereas the natives, they did not have that viewpoint. They saw it kind of as a collective trust. Now, that's not to say that they were just peaceful and they moved and they did everything. They're constantly fighting each other over this prime land, particularly hunting land. And for them, they were by and large hunter-gatherers. And you have Indian tribes in this book who have migrated all the way from Florida. So even within the context of this small story, you have Indians who weren't native to this area, who have left one area, they have been displaced, but they move into another area. And what always happens is they fight each other. And so even within the main tribe in this book, the Shawnees, you have 4 different tribes and there's 2 dominant tribes there. So there's a very tribal warfare. And this is actually not even too different from European culture and history, but you have more established civilizations. You have the tribes of the Protestants fighting the tribes of the Catholics. You have the French and the Spanish Empire, and then you have the English and you have the Portuguese. So it's again very tribal when you look at the overarching point of view, but civilization had not yet come to this part, and neither did the technology that came along with it. And it wasn't along religious lines, although the religion of the natives is really revealed in this book. They do have some similarities to a creational worldview. They believe in a great spirit, and that's mentioned a lot. And as you listen, you're almost like, like, do they believe the same thing? They just need to be told about Jesus. But then you come to find through their fruit and through their action that this is a deceitful people by and large. They're a very cruel people. And because of that, ultimately, it's very clear that they're different from the settlers, and the settlers are shocked, particularly the families that try to move west, basically all the way to California throughout the rest of American history. The people who are settling, who are coming from Christian cultures, sometimes they're passive, but most of the time they realize they can't be passive. And they encounter these very brutal and savage tribes who had only become the dominant tribes of the region, particularly if they had killed the other Indians who were there, and they were constantly at warfare with each other. Even within individual tribes, there were sub-tribes. So that's the 2 different cultures that are clashing. And you have this idea of like community and social hunting grounds, but it wasn't this noble savage mythos. That's a myth. It was actually just who had the most power, and then pretty much who could be the most brutal and subdue the other tribes. And the Americans come in, and they're very quickly, they have to work together. And what I love about this book is you have all these different types of Americans who come from the Irish, the Celts, the Catholic, and then you have the Huguenots, which were the Protestants. And these are the ancestors of those people are some of the settlers moving into this area from all kinds of different parts of Europe who probably at one point in history were at war with each other. And they have to learn to unite together and become Americans. So that's the cool thing about this book is you see the unity of America and the forming of a new nation, a new people group out of other tribes that had come to settle in America. And because of the hardship and the difficulties they faced against the Indian Confederacy, they had to form an American Confederacy. So the mutually exclusive nature of the two worldviews of the frontier basically create an area of bloodshed. In fact, the author, Allan Eckert, has written another book called That Dark and Bloody River. And these books are just filled with battles. It's almost one battle to another as the sequence goes on, because that is how this land was won. So it was a land that was won over great bloodshed. Now, the dual trajectory is primarily painted through two characters. One is going to be Simon Kenton, and the other is Tecumseh. Tecumseh is the leader, and he really is, if you were going to say there was such a character in legend as a noble savage, Tecumseh would be revered as one of those guys. And there's other great Indian chiefs, some who were mistreated. We can think of certain tribes like the Nez Perce, and there's more few examples of natives who were genuinely mistreated than there are ones who basically fought and pushed back and were also devious in return. And at the same time, there are terrible things done by some of the American troops and some of the American settlers who, particularly the Lone Ranger types of guys, are the small bands of settlers who are essentially hunters and trappers. And so these were more barbaric men, and they take on some of the aspects of the Indians. And what we have in the book, and the primary character being Simon Kenton, and it takes a long time for these two characters to collide, but it introduces Simon Kenton and it's tracing his whole arc through the book. Later on, Tecumseh, who is born after Simon, is going to come in as a more prominent character. But ultimately, the book is about Simon Kenton. Now, what's interesting here is they have two very different origin stories, and I'm not going to belabor that because we've already done a breakdown. Me and my co-host Titus Lamb, who actually lives in Ohio in the very same region, lives about an hour from where Simon Kenton's statue is. And we've already covered what is different in the starting point of these two characters. And it's something that I don't want to spoil. You've got to read or listen to the book. Now, really quickly, the early life of Simon Kenton is important. He fled civilization because he essentially was like Moses, running for his life, thinking that he has committed murder. And then he becomes a scout out of necessity. He becomes a frontiersman, but then he becomes a scout. And he is used to help people survive. Initially, it's families and then different forts. And then he goes on to help the United States Army. And then he becomes known. The whole book is essentially him being forged into this beast of a man, not in his nature. He's pugnacious at the beginning, but he becomes self-controlled at the end. But he becomes a man that is so formidable that he is feared and revered everywhere he goes. And that's one of the key things that we want to exhort guys with this book is we want to create this ethos of what a true American was. And when you read about the feats of this man and his brutality and his bravery, and his brutality was tempered by the Christian worldview ultimately, and in a different type of society, he doesn't partake in the torture. He's reviled by it, and he is not gratuitously or maliciously violent. He's violent out of necessity, but he is a formidable warrior, and he is skilled with a tomahawk. He's skilled with a knife, and he's extremely skilled with a rifle, which this flintlock rifle of the time was extremely heavy. It was difficult to maintain, difficult to carry, and if you lost it, you basically lost your life. And so if you think about carrying a 20-something pound rifle in one hand and putting an elk on your back, and you shot this elk, you have to quickly grab it before you are found, since you shot your gun and people can hear where that is. And there's expert native trackers all over the place, or other frontiersmen who could even be enemies. He had to be able to carry that meat, which was going to sustain him and potentially a bunch of other settlers that he was providing for. And he had to carry his rifle, and he had to get out of harm's way, and he had to be able to run many miles at a time to avoid being tracked. So this is the type of skill that it took for men to survive on the frontier. And this is the quintessential brutal American, as we like to say. There are other guys in the book, like I mentioned. Daniel Boone is a side character. He's a more prominent character in some of Allan Eckert's other books, and he's obviously a very renowned woodsman, but Simon Kenton is of the same ilk. Now, There's some really cool art. I don't want to share too much here because we'll post that on our social media, but this is the book cover over here on the left. And then these are some other renderings that I created. And the frontier warfare has been really well documented by some pretty cool artists. So we'll be sharing some of that on our social media, like our Instagram and our Substack. The synthesis to all of this is that there's grandeur and tragedy. So this is a brutal and epic account, and it's an account of victory. You walk away from this book being very proud of your heritage as an American, or very respecting of Americans. And this is something that puts a lot of hair on your chest in the process. But it remains this monumental achievement of atmosphere. It's almost a 600-page book. And so within that, the author treats the indigenous leaders as sophisticated geopolitical players, which they were. Tecumseh is a very sophisticated character. Has a long range vision, which is something really unique. And that's why he becomes, even though he's not born of the right line to be the tribal leader, he becomes, and it's even prophesied over him that he'll become a great leader. But his greatness is going to be limited by his willingness to submit to the superior religion and worldview, which he does have the opportunity to do. So that's something we'll talk about in the book. And then and there weren't hapless victims either. That's also important. It doesn't paint them just as noble savages. It paints them as savages. It paints them at noble at times, but it's not as simple as that. And they also weren't just victims that were run roughshod over. They put up a really good fight, and the Indians were a daunting enemy. And because of that, the frontiersmen had to learn to adapt, and they had to become equal and superior in order to defeat their enemy, in the same way that we did in the War for Independence, but with a completely different type of enemy. So ultimately, the tragedy here is the native dispossession, but you feel the tragedy in individual characters rather than the book trying to evoke an overarching, senseless emotion for just creating victims and tragedy for every single type of Indian, because the Indians are a cruel people. They do a lot of torture, and even the way they treat each other in a lot of ways is difficult to stomach. And because of that, you realize that their people essentially needs to be subdued. And this is the case all over the world in history. This is the case of Israelites going into the land of Canaan and conquering and subduing the people, sometimes destroying them outright because of how wicked they are and that they pollute in the land. Which even Tecumseh himself has this mentality with the Indians who burn people alive. He's repulsed by it because it is a sick and terrible thing, and they do it to some of their own people for various reasons. And so there's all kinds of cultures around the world that have sick pagan practices. And what we see throughout the course of human history is, as people become Christianized, as they embrace the biblical worldview, God gives them dominion and allows them to subdue wicked people groups in a region and to take their promised land. And that's something that God not only sanctions, but he encourages. And when the people who inhabit the land start to take on some of those characteristics, as some of the people in this book do that are on the side of the whites, they are no longer heroes. They're no longer good, and they are subject to die by the sword that they lived by. Now, the heroes who won wild America in its infancy are held in high regard in this book as victors whose ethos marks the grit, the tenacity, and the wisdom which, in God's providence, equip them to dominate a hostile yet fertile land of promise. And that's my own summary of the book. Lastly, this book, The Frontiersmen, helps us to care about our long forgotten fathers. Most of these men you will not have heard of, particularly the main characters that are Americans like Simon Kenton, and we want to live again with them through their story. If this was written in a different way, you wouldn't be able to live it with them. But when you go through the book, you are put in Simon's shoes, and you really feel everything that he feels throughout the course of his 80-year life, which is really miraculous that he survives. Just the first chapter is gripping, what he goes through and the crucible that he's put through. And he's put through another much more intense crucible in basically the first third or middle of the book. What he goes through is something that is more brutal than any of us could possibly imagine. And yet at the end, his arc is one of the most encouraging ends of anybody. So if I could pick my favorite American, it would be Simon Kenton. And I think you'll understand why as you read this book. So ultimately, we want to reflect on the power of narrative and then how it helps these ghosts and these long forgotten heroes of our heritage to come to life. And that's the reason why we chose to read this book. It just happens to coincide with the 250th anniversary of our country. But that's something that we are proud of, and that's something that we want more people to be proud of. And there's not really a better book for you to read to understand what it truly means to be an American, and truly what it should mean to be a man, to be a provider, a protector for the weak and innocent, and also to provide for your people, and to understand who your people are and what lengths our ancestors were willing to go through in order to protect their people and to give them a new land of promise. And we've inherited that. And if we can keep it, then the Lord can do great things through us. So that's the end of my introduction to the Frontiersmen. I hope you enjoyed this, and you can go check out our overview of chapter 1, which we do some other introduction to the book. I tried not to repeat myself too much here, but we want to get you to read it. Buy a copy of the Frontiersmen. Start listening to the book on Spotify if you have premium. It's available as an audiobook, or you can buy the audiobook. Enjoy.